Betsy Henning, and I have the privilege of being CEO of AHA, which is a communications agency, a strategic communications agency, where we focus on helping companies tell their corporate responsibility stories. And of course, transparency is the word of the day. And what I'd like to do over the next few minutes is talk a little bit about the nature of transparency, some of the complexities around it, some of the misconceptions, and places where we get ourselves into trouble with the very notion of what transparency is. We're going to start a few years back. There was a time when companies didn't think at all about transparency. They were just trying to eke out a hardscrabble living in towns on a hardscrabble plain or frontier of our country or other countries around the world. And where those trying to make a living and those trying to make a life came together in commercial Congress. And that was good enough at that time. Early in the last century, however, there came a time when there was just an abundance of corruption occurring in the government and in corporations, and calls for disclosure and insight into what was going on in those companies' finances came to fruition. And that really gave rise to this term transparency. Over time, however, that notion of financial transparency and disclosure was insufficient, so we started asking questions beyond the financial operations and into supply chain and other areas of a business's activity. So that in 1991, the 90s were a big decade for the expansion of transparency and corporate responsibility. And in 1991, when Levi's came out with the Workers' Bill of Rights that said what was going on in other factories, not Levi's own, but those of their partners, was somehow Levi's responsibility, Levi's actually came under attack for that. Not from the NGOs, of course, and probably not from the workers in those factories, although it's unlikely they would have known about it, but from Levi's own competitors who said, this isn't our job. We don't have the responsibility of what goes on in others' factories. Body Shop followed suit shortly thereafter with another Bill of Rights. And again, the competitors, as much as anybody, staked out a claim and said, this notion of transparency is going to be hard on our business. It's going to take our businesses down. So the calls for transparency and the claims against it, it's a confusing landscape of who's for and who's against, and it has been for some time. But in the late 1990s, when Nike became the poster child for sweatshop conditions overseas and their stock plummeted to a third of its value relatively quickly, that was really a sea change for this whole idea of transparency. Nike got caught up in a terrible case of spin, not only in terms of accusations made against Nike about them trying to shape the story or putting marketing around the facts, but in response to those kinds of charges, Nike would come back and just put out individual data points, trying to respond by overcorrecting with a sense of what was deemed to be transparency. And the notion that comes out of that is where we start to really see what transparency starts to shape up like. Because a fact without any context, without any grounding, without anything to give it shape or form, is really what a friend of mine calls a free-floating fact, which is hard to say 3 times fast. But for instance, I had dinner with a friend the other night, and she said that she's a consultant and she works with a company, and she said that company had said that their payroll is $1 million a minute. That's a free-floating fact. Like, I don't know what that means. Are there 1 million employees that are getting paid $1 each an hour, which wouldn't be so good? Or is there one employee who's making out like a madman? So the fact of the matter is that all of these facts, all of this data that we all deal with every day needs some contextualizing to have meaning. And that's what was happening with Nike in that instance, and happens all the time that we see in all these instances where companies are putting out information and it's being contextualized by others if we aren't shaping that story a little bit ourselves as well. And that story is a good thing that gets created because it's the concerns of society, the concerns of employees, of workers in our supply chain, of our shareholders, of the plants and animals in the air that we inhabit the planet with, and even of management itself, conversely to some folks' way of thinking, that these stories come together. But they are stories, and one of the things we have to think about is how do they get told? Most of us in this room will be familiar with that old tale about the 6 Chinamen and the elephant, and each of them is asked to describe the blind men, and they're asked to describe what it is they're feeling, and each of them is telling a truthful story, 100% truthful, and yet none of it is accurate in the whole. And that's the complex, that's a metaphor for the complex communications landscape that we all exist in today as we try and be transparent. Here's another company that went from bad guy to good guy because of some choices that they made and their ability to work with within the context of the NGOs, within government, within the corporate environment itself, to change the shape of their own reputation. Their commitment to sell only CFL light bulbs, to install skylights, changed the nature of how Walmart was talked about in the media, among all of us. It really changed the value of their brand. So in the end, is Walmart a bunny or a duck? It depends on your point of view. Because the shaping of those stories starts to be a little bit like that view in the rearview mirror, is it isn't always quite what it appears. And if we don't have some kind of context, if we're operating in a truly, purely transparent kind of environment, we have a view that we can't see from one place to another. So transparency could look a lot like this. This is everything. I can see it all. Can you see it all? But the naivety of that kind of position makes this a child's game, literally. Just because we can see it all doesn't mean that it's there for us to actually have a view of. And in fact, when we want to look for Waldo, even in a room full of them, our view can be occluded by extreme transparency. So at a time when phrases like crystalline transparency or dynamic transparency or even extreme transparency come into view, we have to understand, what does that really mean, and how do we as a corporation maneuver within that landscape to create meaning, to build value for our companies, for our shareholders, our investors, our employees, and still adhere to the standards that we all uphold and respect. There is just too much information going on in the world, and I love this phrase, infobesity. Even at 140 characters, you can only eat so much of it before you're going to start to get fat. Another phrase I've heard recently is data asphyxia, which I love. But it really is that sense of information overload that can kill you. So where between the notion of too much and too little is the right balance? I like to look at the image of an MRI to help me understand what that really looks like. With an MRI, you get all sorts of information there, but without a knowledgeable expert to help you interpret it, you have no idea what it means. And that knowledgeable expert comes with a code of conduct that gives you trust and reliance that the information you're going to get is meaningful and valuable to you. So it's all about framing the conversation. It's about framing what is happening on the other side where you can't quite see everything in order for you to walk away with valuable meaningful information. In fact, the very notion of transparency requires that there be some material, some substance, some interceding thing between me and you. Because if there isn't, there's no need for transparency, is there? Because we're just right here in the same place with one another. It's the fact that there might be something like a windshield between us that creates the condition that might be translucent or opaque, or ideally transparent. And that's where we get the whole idea of what transparency is. It requires there to be that thing between us. Without it, there would be no need. So that idea of where's Waldo or anything else where we could just put out data and facts and call that meaningful information is really ridiculous. And so it is as important for companies on their side to shape and tell their stories in ways that are meaningful and valuable and disclosing as it is for the folks on the other side, the watchdogs, the NGOs, the interest groups, to make sure that the filters that they're applying to that same set of data all have meaning. Standard & Poor's has a definition of transparency that says it is the timely disclosure of adequate information. I think these may be the three most important words in my presentation. I love that, the timely disclosure of adequate information. It goes on to say the good transparency means that reporting facilitates understanding for a company's true underlying condition. So how do you achieve this? How do you achieve this kind of transparency? You do this by thinking like a publisher. So that's our ask of you as we're here today, is think like a publisher. And a publisher knows that the best communication is one that is read and is valued enough that people come back to it again. So we want to be thinking about what is the right kind of information in what kind of space. What kind of channel, through what kind of medium, over what kind of time frame. Make sure that it involves dialogue, because dialogue is the proof of engagement, and engagement is the foundation of trust and disclosure that results ultimately in leadership. Aristotle, we're going to go way back, but Aristotle talked about virtue, and I know that I'm in a room full of people who want to lead virtuous companies and conduct themselves in virtuous ways, and that what Aristotle talked about as virtue is to the right person with at the right extent over the right time. It's this notion that gets translated in design as the golden mean, this notion of balance, everything in order, and that's really the best way to achieve transparency, is by being respectful of your reader, your listener, your audience, taking into account your business goals, your brand goals, the G4 standards, and pulling all of those things into adequate balance. Thanks for your time.